Hello, John Lai here, CEO at Evermite, and I've got Eunice, Senior Data Analyst that works with a lot of marketing agencies. And we have some questions again, so we'll record some of these. So one of the questions is, well, this is a question that I asked myself. So in one of our previous sessions, we talked a lot about data silos and data integration. And we talked about how it's always good to capture any piece of information that you can. But sometimes when you have a really large stockpile of data, it isn't very usable. And a natural question to this would be, how do you know if your data is usable, or what does it mean for data to be usable as opposed to unusable data? And it's a pretty broad question, and I was wondering, Eunice, if you have any thoughts on that.
So I think it's really good to capture as much data as possible, and a lot of people these days are doing it. But again, it aligns back to, I think, one of our very first videos where we were talking about KPIs. So after we figure out like what our KPIs for ourselves is, we have to then figure out like what data should we use to measure that KPI and go and try to objectify that KPI. So like, if we collect a lot of data that doesn't align and measure towards a KPI, then it really isn't that usable, because we're not really measuring the metrics that are most important towards us. If we do have data that is relevant to our KPI, then that would be something that is usable. For example, like if our main KPI is to increase sales by two times this year, then we would look at anything that is related to sales. But if we're looking at like data that's not related to sales, like example, if we're collecting a lot of web traffic information, that may not necessarily pertain to our sales, and that's not really as usable.
Right, that makes sense. And I think a precursor to that is that sometimes I tell my clients that data is just data. They're answers to questions you may not have asked. So the more important thing is you have to have questions in your mind ahead of time. And then you can look into data and figure out what aspects of that data could actually answer your question. So until you have questions in mind, you just have data, and it's not really useful to you until you start asking those questions and how you want that data to answer your question. I think I'm trying to think of an example of that, because I've had some clients that will just say, oh, can't we just use analytics, or we have the data, shouldn't it tell you everything? But sometimes I guess there's also this concept of structured versus unstructured data sometimes, where let's say, for example, you're pulling a lot of data from, I don't know, some of your social media. Maybe you're downloading some of the comments or text, or people are filling out surveys and they're filling out really large blocks of text area. I feel like sometimes that data isn't really usable in its raw format, and maybe you may want to have another data analyst or someone who knows the information to start tagging that information or parsing out useful bits of that information, either applying tags or categorizing it or classifying it in a certain way so that that information is more meaningful. Otherwise, it's just a big blob of text, or it's just an audio recording of something. And that helps to make this unstructured or these large stockpiles of data a little bit more usable and meaningful. Do you agree with that, Eunice, or am I going off on a tangent, do you think?
No, I think I totally agree that not only do we have to have the right data at a high level, but also how to structure it. So like you may have many different tables of even structured data, but if the tables don't even talk to each other and there's no kind of key to like join the two tables together so that you can use both tables, a lot of data that's not useful as well. So it's just, you'll also have to work with your data architects to kind of understand how to frame the data properly so it's usable. For example, you could be collecting lots of raw data, but because it's not aggregated in a proper format, it would be actually very difficult for the analyst to actually action upon that raw data as well. So you could be collecting tons and tons of sales data for like, for example, e-commerce transactional information, but because there's so much data to start off with, like billions of transactions, if it's in a raw format, it's actually very difficult for an analyst to kind of extract that information and aggregate it together. So beyond just like collecting a lot of raw data, sometimes you might even have to make like an analytics layer or like some kind of aggregation layer so that you can actually make that raw data usable as well.
Right, and actually you brought up another point that just reminded me, building that extra data aggregation layer, sometimes we'll call it data visualization, which is a fancier word for just creating nice reports or meaningful reports. I feel that can help make the data more usable or more meaningful because it's not so much in a raw format. So if you doing things like setting up automated reports that just filter down those key metrics that you want to look at, that definitely helps with making the data more usable. Because sometimes, and if the data is, sometimes it might not even be raw data. It could be hard to access the data sometimes. So if you have data in different silos and you actually need to merge it into a more consolidated format, that's a lot of effort. So the fact that you can't access that data easily could also contribute to data not being usable. So that's another thought I had about that. So Eunice, any other thoughts you might have regarding this question of how to make data more usable? I know it's a very broad topic, but just any other high-level ideas you might want to throw in there.
I think on top of the data aggregation part, like the only thing I can also think about is it's nice to have extra variables within the aggregation layer so that the data scientists or any other machine learning engineers that you might have can create like extra variables to do their statistical modeling or other kind of analysis as well. So it'd be good to have an aggregation layer regardless, just so that you can have the ability to make a lot of your process a lot quicker. And it could be like joining different tables as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Okay, so I think that answers that one question. And we had another